In geometry, we are going to be covering lesson 2.3 in this video, which is about conditional statements. This is the last video. That means there's only 3 lessons for geometry for September 3rd, okay? And as I mentioned, make sure that you go back to chapter 1, finish everything for chapter 1 before you go on to chapter 2. So for chapter 2.3, or lesson 2.3, because we're talking about conditional statements, and we did talk about what a statement is, we need to emphasize a little more the definition of conditional statement. So a conditional statement is a statement that can be written in if-then form, okay? So basically anything where you use the words if and then, okay? For example, if I start school at 7:30, then I need to wake up at 6:30. So right there, in everyday use, a lot of people use conditional statements. We use if-then statements all the time, and we actually break down these statements into 2 parts, which as you'll see in example 1, and I'll pull it up here. Example 1 on page 91, the directions clearly say you're going to see an if-then statement, and you're going to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion of each statement. Now, it seems like a science class. It's not like a science class. You're not really getting the hypothesis of anything. You're just breaking down each part of this if-then statement. And the if-then statement, I did write it right here on this piece of paper. And here it is, example 1. The if-then statement looks like this. If points A, B, and C lie on line L, and that's a fancy L, then they are collinear. As you can see, they use if and then, but they want you to specify which part represents, or they want you to identify the hypothesis of the statement and the conclusion of the statement. The good news is it's really easy to determine what's what without actually really paying attention to what you're reading. This first part of a sentence is always the hypothesis, okay? In an if-then statement, the first part is what we call the hypothesis. And as you can see, I'm not emphasizing on the word if. I'm kind of looking at everything else. So the hypothesis is points A, B, and C lie on the line L, lie on line L. Then the next part where they say they are collinear, that is my conclusion, all right? So the first part always represents the hypothesis. The second part represents the conclusion. I kind of don't need to do example B because it's very similar. Again, the first line represents the hypothesis. The second line represents the conclusion. Now let's go to example 2 on page 92. If you go on to the next page, right, they are going to give you a statement, and then they want you to actually write it as an if-then statement while also doing what we did here. Identify the hypothesis and identify the conclusion. Now, if you can't identify it just yet, I actually recommend that you try to fit in the words if and then within this statement, okay? So I'm going to give you a moment. I kind of started it off. Obviously, each sentence would start off with if, and I was starting it off, but I took it out. I want you to try to write an if-then statement. I'll give you about 20 seconds to look at example A and see if you can write it as an if-then statement yourself. All right then. So if you're not sure where the then goes, the if is the easiest part. The if is always in the beginning. So I'm going to kind of rewrite this. If an angle, and it will kind of sound smooth once you're saying it and writing it down. You'll feel like you'll know where to put the word then. If an angle with a measure greater than 90, okay? If an angle with a measure, and actually you don't want to put a with a measure. So if an angle with a measure greater than 90, or how can I best word this for you guys? If an angle has, instead of with, if it has, you see, you can reword it, that's okay. If an angle has a measure greater than 90, that makes more sense, then it is an obtuse angle. So you can structurally change the sentence a bit, but without changing the meaning. That's important. I can take out the word with and use has so that it could be a bit more accessible to then use the word then. So again, it says if an angle has a measure greater than 90, then it is an obtuse angle. All right? That's how you use and that's how you form an if-then statement if they don't give you an if-then statement. Now, if you're wondering what is the hypothesis and what is the conclusion, remember that first part. So in this case, I'll kind of draw it out like this. This first part is my hypothesis, while the second part is my conclusion. Just like as we did above, the first part of my if-then statement will always be the hypothesis, and the second part will always be the conclusion. So as we do example B, you can try it out again. If you think you need to change the wording to make an if-then statement, then do so, okay? Now, part B of example 2 says this: the length of the course for an inline skating marathon is 26.2 miles. So a long course, in my opinion. So what I want you to do before you even continue, try to create your own if-then statement. Again, I'll give you kind of another 20 minutes. And if you feel like you need to change the wording, kind of like how I did there, that's perfectly fine. I'll give you 20 seconds. Go ahead. All right, so there are many ways that you can always write an if-then statement. It doesn't have to be the way I'm exactly writing it, as long as it makes the statements true. So for example, what I'm going to show you, obviously the beginning should have the word if. If you're writing an if-then statement, the beginning of the sentence should have if. So what are we talking about here? That's kind of the important part. In this one, we were talking about an angle, more specifically an angle greater than 90. Here we're talking about a course, a skating marathon course, right? So if a course is an inline skating marathon, right there, I already feel that I need to put the word then it is 26.2 miles in length. Or you can say it is 26.2 miles or is 26.2 miles long. However that works for you. But as you can see, I have my if-then statement. You see how I didn't use the word length in the beginning? You can always kind of reword the sentence so that it's an appropriate if-then statement. And again, this first part of my sentence is what we identify as our hypothesis. And the second part is also known as our conclusion. So once you know what a hypothesis, you know what a conclusion is, I'm pretty sure you all would be able to do the rest. If you can't read that here, I just realized you guys probably can't read it. But take a look. There it is. If a course is an inline skating marathon, that it has 26.2 miles in length. First part being the hypothesis, second part being the conclusion, okay? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to flip this page over Okay, and I'm going to talk about some other terms that you're going to see on page 93. Okay, now this is also in your printed notes for lesson 2.3. Okay, but some of the key statements here I'm going to copy straight from your printed notes. You know that a conditional statement, so a conditional statement has an if-then, it's an if-then form, right? So it might look like if if this or P, whatever, if so-and-so, then so-and-so. So we're going to represent each statement as a letter. So in this case, we're going to do P and Q. Now we're going to talk about some few other words that you would need to know just in case if they ask you for these terms in your homework or in the textbook or in your quiz. Sometimes they might ask for what a converse statement is. Now, this is not converse like the shoes. A converse statement is basically saying, well, if they give you this is normally given to you, right? If this is given to you, they're going to want you to change it up. So instead of the first part being P, let's say the first statement is now Q. And then they switch P around. So a converse statement is just switch the if and then. Now it doesn't switch where the words if and then is. If is still in the front, then is still in the back. It just switches the statements that are in between. Now an inverse statement, we talked about what the word inverse is probably sometime throughout the past 2 weeks. An inverse statement is when we use words that are opposite. So for example, if they give me if P then Q, then an inverse statement would look something like this. If not P, then not Q. Okay? So basically all they did for an inverse statement, it looks just like a conditional statement. They just threw in the word not. Okay? It's just negating, it just negates the conditional statement. Okay? It just makes it a negative statement. That's all that inverse does. Okay? The last one is what we call a contrapositive. Now, this is not difficult in terms of that you're really doing any crazy math. This is just knowing how to write each statement out. So hopefully this is not confusing you. You are going to see me do an example in a moment of this. So be prepared for that. So a contra statement is very similar to a contrapositive statement is very similar to an if-then statement, but it's also very similar to a converse statement. Okay? So instead of saying if not P, you're going to say if not Q, then not statement P. So it's kind of like they got a converse, an inverse, and made it one big happy family. So you're switch the if then and negating it or making it negative. When I say negate, I mean using the word not. Okay? So this is very important because sometimes they might give you a statement and they want you to make it they might tell you to make it a converse statement out of it. They might want you to make an inverse statement out of it or a contrapositive statement out of it, okay? So I'm going to see which example would be best for us to try. All right, if you take a look at page 94, and this is example 4. I'm going to pull it up in the textbook, but we're not going to really, I'm not going to stay on the textbook the entire time. it says the directions say clearly, it wants you to write the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive, hey, all those words that I seen that we just saw, of the following statement. Determine whether each statement is true or false. If a statement is false, give a counterexample. This is kind of relating to the last lesson we did. Okay, so the statement that they give us is linear pairs of angles are supplementary. So first off, before I even write the converse or the inverse or the contrapositive, I need to write this as a conditional statement. Now, what's a conditional statement? Remember, conditional is an if-then format. So I'm going to use they give us the phrase linear pairs of angles are supplementary. Before I'm able to do all of this, I need to be able to write this as a conditional statement. Okay? Now, pairs obviously mean two, so the best way I can write this as a conditional statement, and remember you can reword it so that this can become a conditional statement. You would say if two, let's say, pairs of angles are linear, then they are supplementary. Okay, see how I used if and then? And that's true. If I have two angles that are linear, linear means that they would make a straight line. If I had two angles that make a straight line, yeah, they are supplementary, because a straight line, right? Something that's a straight line is the same thing as supplementary because they both equal 180 degrees, okay? Now, if I was to rewrite this another way, I can write this as a converse statement, meaning I can switch my Q and my P statement, okay? So I'm gonna leave this kind of right around here. Okay, I'm gonna leave this right next to it. I'm gonna kind of keep that same if two pairs of angles are linear. I'm gonna kind of write this down the opposite way. So this would be a converse statement. Instead of starting off with if two pairs, I'm gonna start off with what comes after the word then, which is if they are supplementary, or I can word it as if two angles are supplementary. See how I'm mixing the order? I'll show you in a bit what I mean. If they are supplementary, then the two pairs are linear. Take a look. I have these statements here. They're written out, right? I started off with the supplementary part. See, my beginning part of my converse statement was the conclusion. So I'm starting off with the conclusion and ending with the hypothesis of the conditional, okay? Now, keeping this again over here, we're gonna write an inverse statement. Now, an inverse statement looks just like a conditional, but using the word not, okay? So it would look like this. If two pairs of angles are not linear, then they are not supplementary. Again, see how I'm using the word not. Okay? So it's just writing the same thing as a conditional statement. I just threw in the word not for both the hypothesis and the conclusion. And the contrapositive, like I said, it's kind of like the converse and the inverse, just now making sure that they're both combined. So the contrapositive would look like this. If two angles, remember I'm kind of copying the converse here. If two angles are not supplementary, then the two pairs are not linear. So there's not really much math to this. It's just knowing how to switch the wording around when it comes to conditional, converse, inverse, contrapositive. Conditional must always be an if-then statement. If they don't have it as an if-then statement, you need to create it as an if-then statement. Then you need to work out with converse, because converse is just like an if-then statement, but switching the hypothesis and the conclusion around. An inverse is just like a conditional, but throwing in the word not for the hypothesis and the conclusion. And contrapositive is a mixture of the converse and the inverse statement, where you're switching the hypothesis and the conclusion and throwing in the word not. Okay? So I hope that this kind of helps you out a bit better. I believe that the most important part of this, especially when you're starting out your homework, is making sure that you know what the hypothesis and the conclusion is, as you did in example 1, and then as you did in example 2, being able to form an if-then statement, okay? Those are the main important parts when you're doing homework for lesson 2.3. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Like I said, throughout lessons 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3, there's really not much math. It's a lot more writing and a lot of saying false or true to each one of these, okay? Have a good one, everyone.